On tonight's show, he is a New York Jets beat writer, Darryl Slater. So, Darryl, how are you doing tonight?
Not too bad, Alex. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, no problem. So, the Super Bowl's coming up pretty quickly here in a few days. So, who do you have in the Super Bowl?
Well, I think the Panthers are just the more physical team, and they have a different dynamic with Cam Newton back there and a quarterback who can run the ball with force in addition to throwing the ball really well. And, you know, their running game is fantastic, and I think Denver's going to have a really hard time stopping that. It's not like they could, in the New England game, Denver kind of pinned their ears back and rushed Tom Brady because the Patriots had no running game, really. But I don't think that's going to be the case here. I think the Panthers will win, 27-20, 31-24, something along those lines. I think it'll be a decent game, but I think the Panthers will win.
Okay. So let's talk about the Jets now. So what do you think the biggest surprises were this season, and the most positive and most negative were about the Jets this past year?
Well, I think some positive impressions, certainly the player Ryan Fitzpatrick. He had the best season of his career in the twilight of his career, which was really unexpected. He works well with the offensive coordinator, Shane Gailey. They have been together in Buffalo, and you really saw that comfort level. I think, you know, additionally on the offensive side, obviously Brandon Marshall had a wonderful year. There were a lot of questions about him coming in with his health, with his ability to kind of, fit in a locker room, and he answered all those questions really, really well. He had an excellent year, and it was a pleasant. I don't know if a surprise would be the right word for the Jets, because he certainly had a track record, but he came in and did really well. I think you could definitely say Fitzpatrick was a surprise. On the defensive side of the ball, I mean, positive-wise for the Jets, Muhammad Wilkerson had just an incredible contract year. He broke his leg in the season finale, but that won't impact too much going forward. He had a great year. I guess on the negative side for the Jets, their offensive line, it continues to be an issue. As it has been the past couple of years, they are aging. Some of these guys are declining. They're going to have to try to find some answers here at center and both tackle spots in the coming years. Even though Nick Mangold, the center, remains very good, you see some signs of age at the tackle spots with the Brickshell Ferguson and Breno Giacomini. And I guess negative on the defensive side of the ball, they really did not have much of a presence from their edge rushers. Calvin Pace, the strong side linebacker, looks very old. They cut their rush linebacker, Quentin Coples, a former first-round pick, midway through the season. He was a total bust. Their weak side linebacker, Demario Davis, couldn't really cover well. Their middle linebacker, David Harris, had a nice year, but they need to figure out some answers at the edge rusher, outside linebacker spot, and that's one of their big things they'll have to do here in free agency.
Now, when you look at the free agents like Fitzpatrick, Wilkerson, Harrison, Ivory, Powell, and Pace, who do you think they will try to re-sign, and in what order of priority?
Well, the primary guys to look at for the Jets free agent-wise are Fitzpatrick. We'll start with him. Obviously, they've said publicly they want to bring him back as their starting quarterback. So they're going to make moves to try to do that in terms of, talking with his people and all that stuff. So, I think it'll be a 2-year deal, 3-year deal with minimum guaranteed money in the back end. They want him back as their starting quarterback. He wants to be back. I don't see any reason why it won't work out. The Muhammad Wilkerson situation is a bit different. He'll obviously be quite a bit pricier than Ryan Fitzpatrick. They could put the franchise tag on Wilkerson, which would basically, in the short version of it, it would kind of set a summer deadline for the middle of July for them to get a long-term contract done. And if they don't, they have to commit $16 million to him for 2016 on a 1-year deal, basically. So, obviously, Fitzpatrick and Wilkerson are hugely important, pending free agents for the Jets. Damon Harrison, their nose tackle, would probably be number 3, I guess, on that list. And you almost put Wilkerson in there with an asterisk because of that franchise tag. But Damon Harrison is a true unrestricted free agent coming up. A really, really good run-stopping nose tackle. Now, let's see how much, he commands, and he has every right to go after every dollar now. At this point, he came in as an undrafted guy and really proved himself. So those guys would be the primary guys. At the running back spot, you mentioned Bilal Powell, and Chris Ivory's also a free agent. Ivory was their better back this past season. He's a better player than Powell, but, with the Jets cap situation, it might be a little difficult with all those guys I mentioned previously, Wilkerson, Harrison, Fitzpatrick. If they're going to try to bring those guys back, Now, how much room are they going to have left for Chris Ivory? And I don't know. It's going to be tough. Mm-hmm. And certainly, he's going to try to get every dollar he can. Mm-hmm. So we'll see. I think a likelier scenario is they bring Bilal Powell back. I'd be surprised if they lost both of those guys. I think Powell is obviously going to be cheaper, and I think they can bring him back and put a complimentary piece in the backfield next to him. So you mentioned Calvin Pace. I think he's done. I don't think he'll play in the NFL anymore, but he had a wonderful run. Mm-hmm. And the guy played, he was drafted in 2003, so whatever that is, 13 years in the NFL. So he had a great run, but I think, you saw the signs of age last year, and I tell you what, he'd be great on TV. I'm not sure if he wants to hang out with any of us media guys anymore, though.
Mm-hmm. So you mentioned Fitzpatrick, and I did too. So do you think if something did happen with Fitzpatrick and the Jets do not re-sign him, do you think the Jets should look at Johnny Manziel?
No, God, no. Oh, my gosh. No. And then I think anyone in the Jets organization would tell you the same thing.
Okay.
Look, I mean, Johnny Manziel is a talented athlete, but he's a young kid who's got a lot of problems that are beyond football. He has issues with anger, clearly. You saw the most recent stuff coming out about allegations about, he hit his ex-girlfriend. He has issues with alcohol, very clearly. He has self-control issues, and that he needs to get his life in order before he figures, before he can get back into the NFL. And, look, somebody might take a risk on him next year as a backup, but he won't be starting in the NFL next year. He won't be slotted as a starter in the NFL, and there is no way the Jets will or should take a chance on that guy because, look, I mean, you take away all the issues that he has, and he doesn't have an enormous track record either. So, yeah, no way for Johnny Manziel for the Jets.
Okay. So when you look at the guys that have been on the Jets roster for the last 2 years, who do you think benefited the most from the coaching change and who has benefited the least?
Well, that's a great question. That's an interesting one that I'd have to take a couple seconds here to kind of think about that. I think, guys who are returning guys. Okay, so David Harris really had a nice year in Todd Bowles' defense, which uses a lot of 8-man fronts, and what it demanded the linebackers to do a little bit more than Rex Ryan did was rush. Let me see if I can kind of explain this pretty simply, but in Rex Ryan's defense, it was a two-gapping defense in a 3-4. So they relied a lot on their defensive linemen to occupy two blockers at the line of scrimmage and have the linebackers kind of sit back a little bit more. Whereas in Todd Bowles' defense, it's more every man in an 8-man front will have a gap that he's responsible for on the offensive line. And so the linebackers had to do a much better job of rushing hard, rushing immediately, and hitting those gaps. And Harris really thrived in Bowles' defense. Demario Davis was unable to, and I think that it was more so because of his own shortcomings as a coverage guy. In terms of other guys, their defense was so different. There weren't a lot of returning guys. Muhammad Wilkerson had a great year. I don't know how much of that had to do with the defense. On the offensive side of the ball, I think this guy, who I'm going to mention now on the offensive side of the ball, benefited the most of anybody on the entire roster from not only the coaching change, but the personnel changes that they made, and that's Eric Decker. And that's because they brought him in, and he was a number one receiver for them in 2014, and that really is not the most suitable spot for him. He needs to have somebody else kind of draw coverage away, and Decker is a fantastic player out of the slot where he can take advantage of the mismatches with safeties and linebackers. With Brandon Marshall in the fold this year, the Jets traded for him obviously last offseason. He could take coverage away from Decker. He could play on the outside, and that enabled Decker to play much more in the slot, and he had a fantastic year out of the slot. He was much more productive. He was great in the red zone. And look, I mean, some of that had to do with Decker being healthier, obviously. Some of that had to do with Marshall being on the field, but I think when you talk scheme and coaching change, a lot of it had to do with that, because Shan Gailey, the new offensive coordinator for the Jets, really did a great job putting Decker, identifying first that he was a good slot player, and then putting him in those situations where he could thrive. So I think that's not so much Todd Bowles, obviously, because Shan Gailey handled the offense and Bowles the defense, but in terms of the coaching change helping one guy, if I could single out one guy in particular from a scheme standpoint that the change helped, it would be Decker.
Mm-hmm. Okay, last question here is before we wrap up this interview is, in your opinion, what were the top 3 moves that Mike McCagnon has made since becoming the Jets general manager?
Oh, that's another great question. Let's see. Well, the Brandon Marshall trade would have to be one. That is a situation that kind of fell into his lap a little bit because of Brandon Marshall's, he just didn't get along with people in the end in Chicago. They didn't like him. He didn't like them. They wanted to move him. They wanted to trade him, and they were willing to do it for not much. Mm-hmm. And the Jets gave up 5th-round draft pick to get him, and it was a 5th or 6th, something like that. But it was one low-round draft pick to get him, and that was an absolute steal. It was a total absolute steal. Now, I mean, it's a mitigating thing because, look, is that his fair market value? No, obviously not. But, the Bears wanted to get rid of him. And McCagnon, to his credit, listened to Bowles, Todd Bowles, the new head coach, obviously, who had been with Brandon Marshall in Miami. And he talked to him, and Bowles kind of vouched for Brandon Marshall. And McCagnon trusted Todd Bowles. They had never worked together. They were both newcomers last year. And that was obviously a big, big move. The trade for Ryan Fitzpatrick, I think, was a fantastic move. And look, I mean, even if Geno Smith hadn't gotten his jaw broken and had been, sidelined for the first part of the year, and obviously he ended up not playing really at all, the Fitzpatrick thing was a really good move because he's a proven backup at the very least. And you never know what's going to happen with your quarterback, whether the injury comes on the field or getting punched in the locker room, but they were ready. The Jets were ready for anything happening to Geno Smith, whether it was his failures on the field, whether it was anything else. They had a great backup plan who turned out to be an excellent starter this year. And look, Fitzpatrick is not a great player. He's an average player, but he had a very good year in the system, and it was a perfect fit because he'd worked with Gailey before in Buffalo. So those 2 trades right there, the Fitzpatrick trade, the Marshall trade, they gave up like a 6th-round pick for Fitzpatrick, or a 5th again, and the 1 low pick to get him. So those were both, as it turned out, steals, who could have known at the time. But and then the other one, I kind of, when you talk about free agency, you talk of the Revis deal. There's a lot of money to Revis, and look, Revis had a good year. He had a very good year. But I'm gonna pick one that I think is a little bit more under the radar because the Jets got this guy for good value. He wasn't a very good player in his previous stop. He's a former 1st-round pick, but he had a really good year with the Jets, and that's the left guard, James Carpenter. He was not great in Seattle, and when the Jets signed him, he was almost an afterthought. He was one of those afterthought-type signings, and they didn't pay a lot for him, but he turned out to have a very strong year, and the Jets really needed a lot more consistency at guard. They had been a mess there the past couple of years, so he was big. And then if I just add one more, maybe it would be Buster Screen, the slot cornerback. Another guy they got for good value, who, because they play so much nickel defense, they really needed consistency at that spot. But McCagnon had a great offseason, man. I tell you, it's hard to pick 3 moves that he made.
And that last question was sent in from Brian from Albany, New York, so a special shout-out to him for sending in that question.
Yeah, thanks, Brian. I'm from Clifton Park, so I'll definitely, any shout-out to Albany is all good with me.
Okay, Darryl, thank you for coming on, and hope to have you on once again, and maybe later in the offseason and during the next Jets football season.
Thank you for having me, Alex. Happy to come on anytime.